Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first Aquinas event in the new academic year. I'm Sister Mary Perniski. I am, for the next hour and a half, the Executive Director of the Aquinas Center of Theology at Emory University, and I want to welcome you to this webinar. We're very excited to have Sister Teresa with us. I am transitioning this evening to the new reality of the Aquinas Center as we head into the future after I have been elected to be the chapter prioress in a new chapter in my congregation. And tomorrow I move to Chicago. So I have been extremely happy to be with you all for the past 3 years. You're not going to get rid of me easily because I'll be coming to the Aquinas Center events, but no longer will I be in leadership here. And tonight I turn over leadership to Alice Cameron, who has been named by our board as the acting executive director. And so I am thrilled that Alice has agreed to do this ministry because she is fantastic and will do an amazing job. And so with that, I'm turning the Aquinas Center over to Alice Cameron, and I am going dark.
Thank you, Mary. And we are so grateful for your vision, your leadership, but most of all for your friendship over the past 3 years. We wish you all the best for this next chapter. I'm also thrilled to welcome you all to this webinar tonight. For those of you attending your first Aquinas Center program, we wanted to share a little bit about our organization. The Aquinas Center has provided community programming that explores the intellectual side of the Catholic Church and its rich traditions for the past 34 years. Our mission serves the Archdiocese of Atlanta, Emory University, and the greater Atlanta community by fostering faith and engaging in dialogue. And now I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Callie Tabor, who is the Associate Director here at the Aquinas Center. Callie has worked with the Aquinas Center since 2018, serving in various capacities, and that includes her work on Aquinas Emory Thinks, which is our community blog. Please check it out, it's incredible. You can do so on the main page of our website. But at this time, please give a warm welcome to my colleague and friend, Dr. Callie Tabor.
Thank you so much, Alice. And I just want to welcome everyone to our first lecture event of this new academic year here at the Aquinas Center. Sister Teresa will be speaking to us about Latino women's faith experience, and this lecture is part of our What's Next series, which explores theological resources from the past and present, which can help make a positive impact on the future of our church. I'd just like to start with a couple of quick housekeeping items. The first is that I'd like to thank our co-sponsor this evening, Commonweal Magazine. For those of you who aren't familiar with Commonweal, their mission is to provide a forum for civil, reasoned debate on the interaction of faith with contemporary politics and culture. To learn more about them, you can visit their website at commonweal.org. And so we want to welcome everyone who's here tonight through Commonweal Magazine. We're really thrilled to have you. Second, Sister Teresa's lecture will have some time after the lecture for Q&A. So if you look down on your screen, you'll have a little box that says Q&A. So while she's speaking, feel free to put any questions you have in the box and we'll take some time to discuss those at the end. And so now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Sister Teresa Maya. Sister Teresa is a member of the Congregation of the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word, and she has been a member in San Antonio since 1994. She is currently serving as congregational leader for her congregation, I believe with about 280 days to go. Sister Teresa received a bachelor's degree in history from Yale University, a master's degree in systematic theology from the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley, and a Ph.D. in Latin American colonial church history from El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. Sister Teresa is a past president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Her primary ministry has been in education. She's served as a teacher, a history professor, and an administrator. In particular, she has a passion for the formation of ministers for Hispanic and Latinos in the United States. So we welcome Sister Teresa to speak to us tonight on La Teología de mi Abuela, learning from women in our Latino community. Thank you, Sister Teresa.
Thank you, Callie, for the invitation, and thank you to the Candler Center for the invitation. And thank you, all of you who are joining us wherever you are on this webinar presentation. I am sad we're not in person and we're still online. But for some reason, I feel that all of this is teaching us a lot of things. And one day we will see both the blessings and the challenges that we have experienced in all these months of this pandemic interruption. I'd like to thank Sister Mary for her leadership and her time at Aquinas and the invitation. And I congratulate Callie and Alice on their new roles as we begin this new academic year at Emory at Candler Center. I want to begin with a few disclaimers because I think they're always important. First of all, I need to declare my bias. I was invited to speak about the Latina woman's experience, but my experience has a Mexican bias. And there are all kinds of Latinas. I always say that the term Latin, Latinx, Latina is plural because you have Puerto Ricans who grew up on the island, Puerto Ricans who were born on the mainland, you have Cuban Americans, you have Central Americans, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, you have Latin Americans from other parts of, Colombia, Argentina, Chile. So there are a lot of different kinds of backgrounds. My bias is Mexican, and you'll hear it in my words and the experience I have, and it cannot claim the whole of the Latina women's experience. So welcome all of you de la isla, from Colombia, from everywhere you are. If you eat pupusas or if you like mezcal or pisco, it doesn't matter. We're all gathered here today. The second disclaimer that I think is important to address before we begin is that Latino, Latina, Latinx, whatever word you're using now, is not a race. It's an ethnicity. You can have Afro-descendant Latinos, you can have blonde Latinos, you can have all kinds of racial different mixtures. So it's not a race, and it's important to keep that in mind because sometimes when we fill out forms, it's very confusing. Mark here if you're white, Asian, and then Hispanic, Latino, so there's all ways of categorizing. And so I think it's critical that we keep those two things in mind. Latino is always plural, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and it is not a race, it's an ethnicity. With that, I think it's critical to begin with a question. How do we integrate the gift of the Latinx community into our parish life, into our community life, into our society, into our university, into our way of doing theology? Or better yet, I would say, why integrate the gift of the Latinx, Latina community in our lives? And I think we need to understand this question critically this evening because things are changing in this country. We just received the results of the 2020 census. However controversial, however difficult it was during a pandemic year to carry out the usual responsibilities of census that are mandated in the Constitution, we learned in this census, 2020, that 19% of the population in the United States is Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, of descent of Latin American or Hispanic descent. 62.1 million people. We could claim that that is an undercount. If it is, there's a lot more. If it's not, it's still a lot. But this is a reality. This is the present of this country, and it obligates a response that is pastoral, that is welcoming, that is integral to the life of our church, our communities, our academies. Secondly, I think we have to also see who is a Latino, a Latina, or Latinx person, who self-identifies as Latino, Latina, or Latinx. And here on the screen, you can see from the Pew Research that among Americans with Hispanic ancestry, it depends on the generation whether they identify as Hispanics or Latinos. So even generationally speaking, you can have all kinds of identities that are mingling with one another and that are changing. And also the census questions have changed. And in many different ways, like I said before, Latino is not a race. And so some people get confused when they're answering questions. So it is very likely that there are a lot more men, women, persons of Latin origin, Latino origin, that are living in this country and bringing the wealth of experience and their willingness to contribute to American culture and society to the present. So the world around us has changed. The landscape, the social landscape has changed. We have to learn how to integrate this gift into our culture. And thirdly, I think it's critical that we remember that we're still in this Quinto Encuentro process. The National Encuentro took place in 2018, but it's still unfolding. So for those of you familiar with Hispanic ministry and the whole process, we know now that the recommendations are unfolding, that there will be a training for members of parishes and dioceses and Catholic communities everywhere. But I think it's critical to remember at the beginning of this conversation that the goal for the Quinto Encuentro was this integration. The main goal of the Quinto Encuentro was to discern ways in which the church in the United States can better respond to the Hispanic Latino presence and to strengthen the ways in which Hispanic Latinos respond to the call of the new evangelization as missionary disciples serving the entire church. So the Quinto Encuentro invited us to integrate the gift of Latinos into our church life, and also to integrate that gift into the greater life of the United States. And so why do we need to do this? We need to do this because that's the present. And if we're reading the signs of the times, we have to do it better. We have to do it better. So this is a critical conversation that we should be having everywhere in this country. And I want to share with you the title that I gave this presentation. I said, why comal y metate? What does it mean to Latino women? So for those of you unfamiliar with those two words, which by the way are Nahuatl words, they come from pre-Hispanic times in that the Mexico that the Spaniards encountered more than 500 years ago. And you should know, really, 2021 is the 500th anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire or the Mexica Empire. So comal is the place where you warm up a tortilla. And here's where my Mexican bias is really important. Because tortillas are basic to the diet of anyone in Mesoamerica, and you always need to eat them warm. So it tends to be a place where women gather because they're the ones that are constantly warming up the tortillas so that you can eat them warm as they come off the comal. And metate is the grinder, where you grind the corn that you then prepare in a masa to make a tortilla in the comal. So the expression comal y metate refers to that daily routine effort that is mostly done by women to feed their families. In places that are very poor, just putting a tortilla on somebody's plate can take all day because you have to have the corn, you have to make it into nixtamal, you have to grind it, and you make the tortillas from scratch. And so comal y metate refers to that space around the kitchen, where women gather, have a conversation, and routinely engage in this labor of love for their families and those around them. And I think that is a good kind of image for the conversation I want to invite us to have today. Let's sit around the table, around our kitchen tables. Let's listen into the conversations that Latina women are having throughout Atlanta and elsewhere in the United States. What are those conversations? What pain are they sharing? What hopes are they sharing? What prayers are they sharing? What are those conversations? What is going on around the households of the Latino community in the United States? And the second part of my title is about La Teología de mi Abuela, the theology of my grandmother. And I intentionally want to speak about my grandmother this evening, first of all, because I can, and secondly, because I think there's something about abuelas and grandmothers in this particular moment that we have been called to live through that is absolutely critical. Abuela died almost 20 years ago. I think she was lucky to have missed the pandemic, but I keep wondering throughout the past year, what sort of things would she have said? How would she have endured and become vulnerable and become resilient throughout this pandemic, as she was through so many other crises that her family and that she had to live through personally? I think we have to listen to the generations. And I think we also have an obligation to pass on the culture to the next generation. And so tonight, I'm going to share some of the wisdom my abuela passed on to me. Hopefully, you will also be able to identify some of the wisdom your own abuelas or the women who are abuelas in your community are passing on to you. Let me introduce you to my Abuela Lupe using the same family album I shared several years ago with the Religious Education Congress in Los Angeles. My abuela was born in 1910, died in the year 2000. A woman of her time in so many different ways, married to Abuelo Clemente and children. That's my mother in the bridal gown, and always present to our family in different times and ways. Lupe, Abuela Lupe, was a very wise woman, but she was filled with little sayings. Donde comen dos, comen tres. Una pizca, or we have to go out and evangelize. There was always a presence about her to what's going on in life and to the family itself. And also a way of recognizing that what is right in front of us, those around us, the situations that we get to live through, that is what is ours to do. That is where we are called to live through mercy. That is where we're called to find God and God's blessing in so many different ways. So I believe we are called to have conversations with the women around us and to ask ourselves, what are the conversations Latina women are having? What intergenerational conversations are we hearing that are taking place around us? What conversations are happening around our Latinx kitchen tables? What is this community worried about? What are they praying for? What are they hoping? And I say this because in many different ways, our Latino theologians have talked often about lo cotidiano, the daily, the everyday experience, as a place to do theological reflection, as the place for theology, as a locus theologicus, as we say. Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, who passed several years ago, but gave us mujerista theology and the point of view of the Latina women in theology was adamant about listening to everyday life, to the women in everyday work, to their struggles, to their pain, to the violence they suffer often, to the scarcity that they have to deal with, to be present in the midst of that reality, comal y metate, next to them, to be able to do good theology. And so today I want to offer that place of conversation with our abuelas, with our mothers, with our daughters, as the place of theological reflection that is absolutely vital for us to welcome the gift of the Latino community into church and society. I will reflect on three aspects of this. The first is memoria histórica, historical memory. The second I call el itacate, or the gifts that Latino women can offer. And finally, how we welcome this gift into our different organizations, institutions, communities as we move forward. So let me start with memoria histórica, with what and how we remember. What and how we remember. I believe that to welcome the gift of Latinas into our communities, we need to do the work of memory. That's why I like to honor my abuela. I like to remember, to bring her insight, her joy, her pickiness about stuff. You know, if food doesn't have chile, it doesn't taste like anything. But to bring all of those flavors and smells and the images that were around her house to the present, because they teach me something. They teach me something about being Catholic, about being a woman, about thriving in society despite all the adversity. And memory is absolutely critical to all of us. I laugh because when my sister and I get together, we remember Abuela differently. Sometimes she says, you know what, your abuela was different from my abuela, but it was the same abuela. How come I don't remember that? And how come you remember this? And so sharing the memories creates a common memory, a memory that in many different ways holds the whole of the family together. No one of us can remember everything. But as we share and enter into this conversation, we start building a collective memory that is essential for us to move forward. Recently, I heard a podcast, and I'm a big fan of Dr. Laurie Santos at Yale University. And she has this podcast called The Happiness Lab. And she aired in season 3 an episode titled Why Nostalgia Ain't So Rosy. Why Nostalgia Ain't So Rosy. Now, I am a daughter of the 80s, and she did interview Rob Lowe, so I was very curious about what the two of them were going to talk about. But Dr. Laurie Santos, in that episode, speaks about the tricks that memory can play on us, how we remember selectively, or how we delete some of the files when the difficult experiences, or like video editing, we can remember only the pieces that had the interesting things, but not the hours and hours of waiting at the airport because we missed a connection, but only that was the most amazing trip I've ever had in my life, because that's how the brain edits out some of the things that were more difficult or more painful. Applied to collective memory, we can be very nostalgic about a past that we have selected only some of the clips out of. In the case of the Latino-Latina experience in the United States, there are a lot of gaps in the nostalgic collective memory we have of the good old days. Gaps where we don't remember because it was edited out of the video, what we did, for example, with internment camps for some people, or repatriations of even American-born citizens in certain times, or simply we don't think they were there. So memory, recovering memory, is a critical first step to welcoming the gift of the Latino community. No, not all Latinos are recent arrivals. If we go to Santa Fe, we will find whole communities that the border crossed them. They never crossed the border. When the US took over the Southwest, all they did was stay in place. Extensive communities throughout the Southwest that simply are descendants, fourth, fifth, sixth generation of Hispanics that were in this country and the border crossed them. But we often don't speak of that. Or men and women who are descendants of Latinos that came during the Bracero program, or at the turn of the century, or the Puerto Rican history with the United States, which has always been so complicated and complex. We don't know a lot of those stories. How do we recover la memoria histórica, historical memory? The historical memory of the valiant women that have come before us. I believe it is time, absolutely, to enter into this conversation. So if any of us were to go back and look at that family album, those photographs, if we could ask each one of those pictures what their whole story was, what tales would they tell? How would they describe their experience of being Latino or Latina in the United States? Not the same thing to be a Cuban American in Miami than a Chicano in Los Angeles during the Suit riots. Not the same thing to be living in New York as a Dominican American or a Puerto Rican American. It's not the same thing to be a fifth generation Hispanic family in New Mexico than to be an undocumented migrant in Chicago. What is the memory that we need to recover from all these plural, multiple, varied, and very rich experiences? And if we don't do that work of memory, it is very difficult to move forward in a different way. Recently, the Mexican president, as Mexico is celebrating the 200th anniversary of the consummation of its independence, requested or demanded, I guess, that the King of Spain or Spain apologize for what happened during the 300 years of Spanish rule. And he also requested that the Pope apologize once again, because he did already at the 500th anniversary of the time of encounter in 1992, that he again apologized for the church's complicity in the process of evangelizing the native peoples. Pope Francis has been grappling with this, but he actually made a statement that I find is very revealing. Pope Francis said, "We do not evoke the pain of the past for its own sake, but rather to learn from it and take steps to heal the wounds and construct an open dialogue that respects differences and build a much desired brotherhood, sisterhood, giving priority to the common welfare over private interests." Giving priority to the common welfare over private interests. Pope Francis has been speaking in some of his trips of the importance of purifying memory. Notice he doesn't say cleaning memory, but purifying memory. He talks in the same light as all of these truth and reconciliation commissions around the world. We have to go back and look at the whole of the memory. Think of what is happening in Canada. Think of what's happened in Central and South America, and all of those processes of trying to recover the full picture of the experience so that we can now, in the present, realize the giftedness of this community that we haven't seen often or noticed, and then build a common future together. Memoria histórica, historical memory. It's not the same thing as history. History is there, it's an academic field. Memoria is something that's active, that acts in us, that transforms us as we move into the future. I think, for example, of Colombia, after all those years of violence. Colombia has efforts around memory as an ally for peace. Memory as an ally for peace. And they speak about what is memoria histórica, what is historical memory. And here's what we can learn from our Colombian brothers and sisters. Why is memoria histórica necessary? First, knowing about different versions, listening to the stories that have remained hidden for decades cannot change what happened, but the memory can change our current knowledge of history, affecting both the present and the future. Remembering is a right, and for many, a duty, to be able to forgive and close open wounds. Recovering their memories allows those who have felt as victims, who could not claim or revindicate their history, to assume an active role in the re-elaboration of a collective memory. Notice it's memory, not history, that we're talking about. Today, second and third generations have the opportunity to share a new story about the past with the emotional distance and the democratic tools at our disposal. A narrative where both victims and perpetrators can adopt new meaning, where historical confrontation can take a step into pluralism of stories that allow for the future to know a necessary and different history. And I emphasize this because sometimes the task of memory is the duty of the second and third generation. So when I speak of Abuela, it is my duty as the third generation to remember and explore her own story. As a woman in the 1950s in Mexico who had very little rights, as a woman who struggled to get an education and have a job, when I recover her memory, I understand why her struggle and her efforts were so much more valuable to those of us today. Memoria histórica is the first task to be able to integrate the Latina experience into our communities. Recently, I have been learning a lot about the struggles of the Aboriginal or the First Nation peoples in Australia. They're currently in this process of trying to change the constitution in Australia so that it recognizes the gifts of Aboriginal people. There's a statement that they've put out that you can find on the internet. It's called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And what struck me was in one of the presentations, they said, hidden stories and assumptions continue to hold us back. Reconciliation is a way of life, not a destination. Reconciliation is a way of life, not a destination. And in the case of the Latino experience in the United States, there are a lot of moments that were very painful. Not as painful, I would offer, as the African American community, but there were lynchings of Latinos in Texas. There were signs on lawns that said, no dogs or or Hispanics allowed or Mexicans allowed. There was segregation in school and education. And up to this day, a lot of issues, even around citizenship, people who are being stopped in the street and racially profiled. There's a lot of pain in the community. And so how do we recover all of that story, but then use reconciliation as a way of life? How do we start telling the full story? And we need to tell our personal and community stories. We need to remember together. And storytelling is at the heart of the Latino culture, like many other cultures. And yet, I believe we all need to become more brilliant storytellers. Let me tell you just a memory that I have that I find fascinating. My grandmother, like many Latino grandmothers, used to set up a big nativity scene in her house with the Mary, Joseph, and the mule and the donkey and chickens and sheep and shepherds and all kind of wells, and anyway, the magi over there, everything was all set up. And I used to love it because, and I found this picture, which is not exactly her nativity scene, but it reminded me of the story, because she, after she laid out all of the nativity scene all over the place, she would put a little rooster at the very top, and that where the arrow's pointing. And I said, Abuela, why is there a rooster there? She said, because the day that Jesus was born, the rooster sang, Cristo nació, Cristo nació. Jesus was born. And then the donkey responded, ¿Dónde? ¿Dónde? And then the sheep said, Vamos, vamos, let us go. That is a memory I hold. It is a memory that embodies the Christian story where all of creation, including the animals, are in telling this news about the birth of Jesus. Memory has a healing power for all of us. La memoria histórica also has a way of creating community, a collective memory, embracing difference and diversity. And so we have to ask ourselves, what happens when abuelas cannot talk to grandchildren because there's a language issue? What happens when children are separate from their grandparents and can't visit with them because of all the legal status issues that we haven't been able to deal with in the United States? How do we keep these stories alive for one another? How do we tell these stories into the future and we create an intergenerational conversation, a conversation of diversity and collective memory that we need to share? How do we connect our storytellers with the next generation of Latina women? Memoria histórica is the first task for us to integrate this gift. Now I'd like to move to the second part of this reflection, which I call el itacate, or the provisions. What gift can Latina women offer our church and society? Again, I'm using a word from the kitchen, from the Mexican kitchen, from Nahuatl. Itacate means kind of like your lunchbox or your provisions or your picnic basket. But in Mexican families, grandmothers would normally say, te preparo un itacate, if you were going on a journey or a trip or leaving the house. In other words, do I prepare something for you to take with you so you can be nourished along the way? Can I offer you something to eat as you go forward? So itacate can mean so many things, but it's always something prepared by our mothers or grandmothers. And of course, some fathers and brothers, but normally it's the mothers and the grandmothers. And I want to say, what is in this itacate? What is in this basket of goodies as you move forward in life that Latino women offer us today? First, I think radical hospitality. Radical hospitality. And what does that radical hospitality mean? It means table fellowship. There's always food in the Latino community, and it's usually prepared by the women, but there's always food to welcome you to the table, no matter who you are. All are welcome. All are welcome, whether you speak Spanish or not, whether you like chiles or not, whether you're our friend or not, all should be welcome. There's always enough. You never turn someone away. In fact, you normally overfeed them, but there's always enough. And often around a table like this, difference is appreciated, or at the very least, respected and tolerated. There's a hospitality that enfolds us, that is welcoming, that makes you feel at home, where you can sit at the table and you don't feel that you don't belong. You don't belong. Second, what is in this itacate? I want to say an unfolding mercy, an ability to forgive over and over and over again. What does unfolding mercy mean? It means that divergence and difference and disagreement can happen, but you're still welcome in the family. You're still forgiven no matter what you did. Think of prison visiting lines. So many of our Latin brothers and sisters are incarcerated. But who goes to visit them? It's the women in the family. It's the abuelas and the mothers and the wives and the sisters. Welcome always. Be curious, be respectful, Abuela used to say. Tú no sabes, Tere, por qué la gente es así. You don't know why people are like this. Tú no sabes por qué piensan así. Mejor pregúntales. Be respectful. Be respectful. Everyone belongs. Everyone belongs. Así lo hizo Dios. That's what my grandmother used to say. God made them that way. But how do we allow people to just belong? And she used to say, se puede amar sin entender. You can love perfectly without understanding. Unfolding mercy. I always used to say, God's mercy cannot be smaller than my grandmother's. If she could forgive the drunken son, if she could welcome the one that had done something wrong, if she could forgive over and over again, that to me was a sign that God's mercy was bigger than that and can enfold her mercy and everyone else's. What else is in the itacate? Accompaniment. Acompañamiento. You journey with people. You need to be present to others, she used to say. Hay que acompañar a la gente, hay que estar. If somebody was sick, she would go and visit and bring an itacate, bring something to eat. If someone had died in another family, she wanted to go be present at the funeral, at the wake, at the rosary. Be present to others, to be available and willing to accompany. I still remember, if we wanted to go someplace, all we had to do was call Abuela, and then she'd go with us, and then we got permission. Even if it was something she didn't like to do, I guess that's what abuelas do. They go, they accompany, they're present, they love just being there. The art of accompaniment is something I learned from my abuela. It's a gift our Latino women have. They're always there, they're present, they come. Sometimes too many. Sometimes you don't want them all to come, but they come anyway. They love to be present to others. And finally, la bendición. La bendición. What is in this itacate? La bendición. That is one of my older sisters blessing someone else. Pero la bendición. Abuela, dame la bendición. Hijito, no te vayas sin que te dé la bendición. Don't leave without my blessing. Blessing, Father Rollheiser reminds us in his book, comes from benedicite or benedicere, to speak well of. We need to practice blessing. We need to bless the next generation and enjoy the next generation. Abuelas who bless, abuelas who are constantly, generously giving blessing, remind us of a God who blesses, of a God who blesses. Blessing in that way, blessing as a gift. How many of our Latino and Latina brothers and sisters, our Latinx people, we see them how their mothers go, no, ven para acá, la bendición. And the mother offers a blessing. And the grandmother offers a blessing. La abuela bendice. There's something about blessing others that draws us to them, that really is God's call toward all of us. Accompaniment, acompañar. Isn't this what Pope Francis has been challenging us to? Going forth, salir de uno al otro, go from here to there, en salida. Accompaniment requires movement. It requires moving toward the other, being hospitable to the gift that they are. So I think here we can frame this conversation in the same way that Jesus taught us in the journey to Emmaus. In many different ways, this gift that Latina women can offer us is an explanation, a practical application of the lessons from the journey to Emmaus. A painter that does something for paintings, art for our healthcare ministry, Daniel Bonnell, painted this, The Road to Emmaus. And that's the image that appears on your screen. When I see that story, I think of how the way my grandmother was, the theology that she taught me is really a way of practicing this. First, we find Jesus himself came near and went with them. Then, after journeying for a little bit right next to the two disciples, there's a question. What are you discussing with each other while you walk along? And finally, there's a meal. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Jesus approached. He came with, he accompanied, acompañó, se acercó. That's what my grandmother used to teach me. Jesus listened. First, listened. In an Abuela theology, there has to be a lot of listening first. And finally, there's a meal, una comida. There's a sharing, a table fellowship. So we have to, in different ways, appreciate these gifts that our Latino women bring to our church today, and learn from this daily place of living ordinary life, and how blessed that is, and how incarnational that is, and how it creates community and weaves it with the rest of society. What else? What else is in the itacate, in the basket of food Latino women offer our church and our communities? There are many, many other gifts, but I offer these as mine. I'm pretty sure many of you are identifying others. And I'm sure that those of you with nonas, Italian grandmothers, and yayas, and Jewish grandmothers are finding echoes as well of this giftedness that these generations offer us, if only we remember. Si nos acordamos. And finally, I want to offer that there's a task for the rest of us. There is a task for church and society, for our parishes, for our theological schools, our universities, our hospitals, our organizations, to welcome the gift of Latina women. And so I want to say, donde comen dos, comen tres. Everybody fits. That's what my grandmother would say. Where two eat, three can eat. But how do we welcome and encourage Latinas. And I think that is also a mandate, a task for our times. We need to be intentional. We need to do something. It is not enough to appreciate, to remember and appreciate. We also have to include, to welcome, to mentor. And so I'd like to offer some key ideas about how to do this that have to be critical in every organization, board, etc. that we have. The first, of course, is inclusion. The first is inclusion. We have to be intentional about including Latino women. We have to be intentional. We need to learn how to honor and appreciate diversity. We need to build welcoming communities. We need to start noticing that perhaps our communities are not as diverse as they should be. This committee or this board or this classroom or this seminar, how do we become more and more aware when there's diversity missing around our table? And when we're not diverse enough, we have to borrow diversity. We have to borrow diversity so that we can start speaking with one another. We can, in many different ways, replicate that table fellowship my abuela taught me about. Secondly, there has to be encouragement. There has to be a willingness to really encourage Latino women to take their place, to speak their voice, to belong. We say in Spanish, animar, hay que animar. I love that word because animar comes from animus, to breathe, to give a breath, to give a chance to breathe and to be part of. There have to be mentorships. We have to reach out and mentor. There has to be active support of Latino women, all Latino women, young and old, girls, so that they feel they're part and that they belong. Animar, as I said, can be translated to cheer, but really is to breathe spirit into and to practice accompaniment. If we don't mentor, if we don't find women in the community that just need a leg up, that need someone to encourage them to get out of a violent situation in the family, to get an education, to improve their literacy, to get a chance, if we don't offer that, because they don't see themselves in certain areas of society. There's no mirror. If I don't see myself in an organization, well, I don't think I belong. I shy away. Well, venga para acá. Let's, as a sister of mine used to say, when someone invites you, keep your foot at the door so other Latino women can come in. And then there's the task of advocacy. So important in our country today, to stand with, in front, behind, next to all of these women that are fighting for rights. Think of the dreamers in our universities, in our hospitals, in our organizations. They can't be their own advocates. Who's standing with them, in front of them, to defend them from people that don't understand that they are? This is all the country they've known. To be behind them, to encourage them to move forward, or next to, so that they don't feel alone in their journey. Sign petitions, write letters, or as some of the sisters I have met across the years, they say, Tere, I have become a digital activist. Let's put out a good word for the Latino community out there. They shouldn't be alone. Let's get educated. Let's learn about this history. No, it's not in our history books because, well, history books are really 400 pages. You always have to select some things, but why not include other lessons? Why not? This is Hispanic Heritage Month. Why not learn about the Latino movement in agriculture, about Cesar Chavez? Why not learn stories about the Latino contribution in the military and how many won medals fighting for the US in all the wars? Chime into conversations. Don't let those conversations pass. We hear terrible things. If only they went back to their country. Well, let's chime in and say, you know what? They're essential workers. You know, agricultural workers, most of them are migrants. And if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be eating right now. In fact, there's issues in California and other places because we can't find enough people to work there. Visibility. We have to work with our cultural blindness because we don't even notice some of these invisible workers. Agricultural workers, we never see. The workers in our meat factories or at other places, construction workers, the custodian services that happen at night. We don't know who cleans our offices because they work and they're instructed not to be seen. Que nadie los vea. And so we don't see them. How do we work on our unconscious bias so that we can start noticing and appreciating as we notice? We absolutely need to learn to see. And so I'm going to give myself permission, even though we are live, to offer you a movie trailer. And for homework, I hope, if you haven't, you watch this movie. And I want you to listen to a little clip that is part of this movie trailer. Here we go. I hope the technology works. So I want to invite you to go watch that movie, In the Heights. But there is a piece in that clip, the little details that tell the world we are not invisible, that I find absolutely moving and challenging. Why is it that there are more than 60 million Latinos in the United States and we still don't see them? Why do we still say that they're migrants or first generation or undocumented when many of them were born, are US citizens, had fought in these wars for this country and have contributed so much to what it is today? So how do we learn to appreciate the gift of the Latino community? How do we use art like the movie In the Heights, but how do we use art and how do we support Latinx artists? How do we enter into the stories, Latinx literature? Do we read Latino writers? Do we read about the community? Do we watch the movies, listen to the music so that our spirits can be nourished by this gift? And then we can start to notice and appreciate. I think that there is a task for all of us. It is a task of welcoming, a task of embracing the gift and the diversity. Como decía mi abuela, donde comen dos, comen tres. We all can belong. We can all have a place at this table. That is our church, that is our community, our parish, or our institution. So thank you. Thank you for spending time in comal y metate. I pray that we can discover the blessing of Latina women in our everyday lives. Thank you for this invitation, and I hope we don't have too many questions.
We do have a few questions for you, but thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. You know, as you were taking us through, you know, those values of radical hospitality and mercy and accompaniment, I was thinking how much it resonated with Pope Francis, and I was thinking, you know, people talk about the Jesuit influence on Francis. They talk broadly about, you know, the kind of influence of Latinx theology, but like we should talk more about the influence of Latina women in particular upon Pope Francis's theology, and what do they have, you know, where do they stand in that papal teaching actually? So
absolutely, I'm pretty sure Pope Francis had an abuela, and I believe that many of the teachings of Pope Francis are very Latin American. Mm-hmm. A way to understand Pope Francis is to understand the culture that he comes from. Absolutely, Kaylee.
Yeah. All right, so a first question for you is, someone's asking, what would you say to a diocese or a parish that asks Latino families not to teach the children prayers in Spanish because they believe that praying in Spanish at home confuses them? And even more, how do you begin a healing process for families that don't understand why they're no longer allowed to pray with the children because they pray in Spanish?
Well, I would say there's a lot of research, but there's two things you always do in your native language. You pray and you count. And I always tell my sisters that, and I say, when they pray the rosary in English, I feel it doesn't count because it doesn't sound or feel like the rosary. So praying in your native language is absolutely vital to your spiritual life. And alienating children from that experience it just shuts down part of their soul. And so I think we can learn from First Nation peoples around the world that are recovering their language, because language is culture, language is memory, language holds the DNA of our deep spiritual life. I think we need to teach children to pray bilingually. There's absolutely nothing wrong with bilingual, and our children are very comfortable in English, but they can switch into Spanish. Why is it that they can sing? There's the music. You can talk about the really famous songs. Now our American-born, American non-Latino children are singing in Spanish, and our children. So if music can happen in another language, all the more reason for prayer. So I would say, no. This whole idea that if you don't only speak English, you're not American enough. It's not the 21st century. I'd say bilingual would be the way. That would be my bias.
And then we have two questions that kind of, I think, speak into each other in many ways, which is one person asking, how do older women include younger women in their experiences of theology and in recovering their stories? And another asking about what is the space for young people in the church who aren't really sure how they fit into this larger faith community anymore, into the Catholic Church as they move into adulthood?
I think the generational question, and that's why I wanted to talk about abuelas, is absolutely relevant. And I think we need to approach one another with more curiosity and more welcoming hospitality than anything. I think, for example, when I was a little kid, abuela, you say, you girls have to do this because you're girls. And you, my brother, no, because you're a boy. And my sister and I mean, that was like the little feminist in the two of us would just like explode. And eventually, I learned to understand that was grandmother's context. Abuela came from a different time. I mean, it was very difficult for her to cross into this, 21st century of women's rights and voting and whatever. That didn't stop me from loving and appreciating everything she could offer. But I also would have to say, abuela, ya no son esos tiempos. Those are not the times we're in. My brother better do his thing, And so I think this conversation requires openness. I think there's a gift. So we got to approach it as blessing. I think younger women today have lots of challenges, but they also have a gift. Their advocacy for the community, their willingness to go into the workplace, their love for nature. And I was listening this morning to a podcast about someone that's passionate about climate change. And so I think we come together in table fellowship. I think that's what our parishes should be, a Eucharist that gathers, all the gifts come, and then we go forth as one. So I do think it's a challenge. It's not simple. There's small ways of doing it and big. Sometimes it's common projects in the community, accompaniment of women who are in need. I think mission is what brings us together.
Mary has a question. So she's right. It's that she's had a number of conversations with white people who get really defensive when the stories start to emerge of the past that has sort of been left out of the memory. And so she'd love to hear you reflect on how we remain in conversation and how we kind of start to break down some of that defensiveness. How do we uncover the memories that some of us don't want to hear?
Well, Callie, I'm a historian by training. And even though I've been in religious life and in leadership in my institute, I'm still a historian by training. And I learned something critical when I was doing my history work or teaching, that history is an unfinished thing. It's never complete. For example, when we could analyze the DNA contents of the mummies, we learned about the food ancient Egyptians ate, and that changed our history of Egypt. Or when women at the turn of the century, 180 or 60 years ago asked, well, what was it like to be a woman in the Roman Empire? It changed our history of the Roman Empire, because then we started asking questions. What did women do? Because all we had were like the histories of the emperors, the great man, his theory of history. So questions today will change how history evolves. And so it's okay to have an unfinished product. It's actually more brilliant, more interesting. Science is bringing new tools to, archaeological digs. And so I think the new questions will reveal even more interesting and potent facts about history. For example, of books that are written about, Catholic sisters 800 years ago, like Hildegard of Bingen, and when we learn what she was able to do. But those are new questions. They're not questions that were asked 200 years ago. And so history is an evolving thing. You kind of keep adding to it. It grows, you deepen your understanding of it. So I would tell people, lighten up. It's all right. We're learning new things about everything. We're learning about what music people heard, what food they ate, how they organized the household, what they valued, and because an archaeological dig can change everything. So I think in many different ways, it is an ongoing, unfolding mystery. We'll never know the whole of history. We can't bring people back and interview them. Like, okay, so why did you go now into this war and not the next year or the year before? But we can always, new things are revealed, discovered, read. And so I think until we start completing that and entering into that ongoing process, we won't really appreciate history fully. I love history. I love all of it. I love the good, the bad, the bizarre, because there's everything there. So I would just say, let's keep reading history,
And, it was so interesting to me how you were using some of Pope Francis's language about purifying memory rather than cleaning, because I think that also is challenging how we understand both purification and history in our theological kind of imaginations, because I think a lot of times we tend to think of purification as sort of that kind of abstraction and that sort of wipe the slate. And what you're kind of inviting us into is actually, let's move deeper into the details. Let's move deeper into the story and into the kind of incarnated world that we live in. So could you say a little bit more about that and how you understand that?
Well, I think memoria histórica is exactly that, is that let's recover the memories, including the difficult and painful ones. In our church, sometimes we gloss over or skip over the things that weren't that great. And so whether it's our personal history, our family history, our communal history, or church history, we need to embrace all of it, because that is the mystery of the incarnation. God was incarnate into the messiness of human life. And our life is never all perfect. There's good intentions, bad intentions, indifferent intentions, there's omission. The same thing with our institutional history. If people will say, I don't want to be Catholic because of what happened. Well, there's all kinds of things that happen, not just in the recent history, but in, just look at the history of the popes if you want. But in the end, it's that pilgrim church, is that It's that human side that unless we recover that, we're also not as patient with, flaws and sins and difficulties. And we learn that this is a journey. So I think that is what Pope Francis means. Mm-hmm. He's just saying, let us just accept our humanness, our wholeness as humans. I think that is the call of the incarnation for us. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, it does. All right, another audience question. How can the blessing be included in American culture? This audience member says it's very Puerto Rican as well. And on my island, we used to say benediction. And for example, aunts or parents or uncles or godparents or grandparents would answer, Dios te bendiga.
I do think that is one of the most beautiful contributions of the Latino culture into the United States. And I think that, learning to send someone in blessing, I think, sisters in religious institutes do. That's what the church does. Nos da la bendición el Padre. Padre me da la bendición. And so I think it's part of our Catholic tradition. And I think in many different ways, liturgy and sacrament are one of the beautiful gifts of our tradition to this country, to our society, however plural it is. And so let me offer a blessing. Let's send forth in blessing. And so I think it's a practice that we need to cultivate. And it really offers the best in us to you, whoever you are, that I'm blessing. And dar la bendición is just I think something, when you leave and someone says, let me give you my blessing, or let me offer you a blessing as you go in this journey, there's so many small ways of doing it that I think it's absolutely precious. And I hope we don't lose it over time.
Yeah, I think it's such a beautiful practice, that really lovely gift. Another question. Can you share your thoughts about how socioeconomic class plays into memoria histórica being shared and heard? Like Abuela Claudia, sometimes I feel that there is a bit too much paciencia y fe. What about impaciencia y preguntas?
I think that we have not had enough conversations in this country or Latin America about class. I do not believe we should romanticize culture. I think every culture needs evangelizing and transformation. And that is why the integration and the interaction, what we would call interculturality, is such a gift in our church. I believe the Latino community can learn from American church and society. Things as simple as the value of women. And machismo is a terrible thing in the Latin American culture, but women standing up for their rights in the US is something that empowers Latina women. So I think in the flow, in the conversation, we get what Virgilio Elizondo used to call mestizaje. We get something totally new. It is not true that when the Latino community keeps their language, they don't become Americanized. They do, they speak Spanglish. And, you can have tacos here and tacos there. And so I believe that we shouldn't romanticize culture. We should understand that every culture has a dark side and a bright side, and there's a mingling of that. We also should understand there's a gift in this flow of culture. And that is why I think the United States is a privileged nation, because all these cultures mingling create a something new that it continues to evolve. And in terms of class, there is a class culture, and there are class differences, and there are things that require justice and reparation and change. And so I do not believe that we should just be patient, though we should also work for justice. That's why I named advocacy as one of those values.
Returning to the theme of blessing, one of our audience members is asking if you can kind of share a blessing that folks might use in English who maybe didn't grow up with the blessing culture that they might begin to utilize with friends and family.
I think it starts with simple everyday language. When I think of the many different ways that that we send people forth. You know, my older sisters, for example, in the community will say, I'll go visit them and I'll be leaving the room and they'll say, que Dios te bendiga. May God bless you, or blessings on you. It has to become language, and that's where language is powerful, and we have to verbalize it, you know, or sometimes we have to use nonverbal language, you know, just a poem, you know, an accompaniment and a show of presence, holding someone's hand. I think there's so many different signs and symbols that we do, and that's a very Catholic thing. So I think it starts with simple everyday language, just kind of the practice of blessing. Even when someone doesn't hear the blessing, you know, someone is leaving, they might say, I don't want your blessing, but you still whisper it. That's what my Abuela used to do with my brother. Abuela, no quiero tu bendición. I give it to you anyway, you know, so I think it's part of that practice.
I think so much of what you're talking about, you know, you're bringing in these practices of lo cotidiano, and it's that richness of presence to our lives, right, as well. And that blessing culture brings that presence to us. And I've seen a number of comments here, people mentioning how much they love the way you're talking about story, and some people just saying they love In the Heights in general. But it's reminding me, besides, you know, lo cotidiano, another, you know, really kind of gift from Latinx theology in the last 40 years, let's say, has been like a real emphasis on theological aesthetics, on the importance of art and story and beauty for us as church and how we are church together. And I'm wondering if you just might say a little bit more about how do we as church really bring that into presence when we are together in community in a way that honors the importance of that to this richness of life?
I'm going to tell you a story. A long, long time ago, Abuela was still alive. I was going to school at Berkeley, and I used to go to Mass at the Newman Center. Now, those of you that know the Newman Center, please forgive me for what I'm about to say, but I believe it's one of the ugliest churches I have ever been to in my whole life. Very gray. It's all cement. And Abuela came. She sat next to me. She was all upset the whole time. Finally, I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "You didn't tell me you were Protestant." I said, I'm not Protestant. This is a Catholic church. No, it's a Protestant. She was super upset. I went with the priest. I said, "Please tell my grandmother it's a Catholic church." But that's because there was nothing. It was just very super plain gray, you know. And I realized that day that Abuela loved the aesthetics of church. The music, the incense, the flowers, the saints, everything, the sappiness, the candles, the whole thing. And that made her feel at home. But I believe that Latina community has that gift of recovering the aesthetic, the experience, the artistic experience of our spiritual lives. We need image and symbol and music and smell to really enter fully. That's incarnation. So I really would encourage that this time in particular is not a time for a lot of words, and forgive all the words I used, but I think we need more beauty, more music, more images, art. And I would just encourage everyone that is an artist, and if you know someone that is an artist, encourage them. We need them, because that is a language that will bring us together. Dancing together will bring us together. Having a political conversation will not.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And on that note, I think we have in the chat a note of gratitude to you, not so much a question, that I think gets to the way that evoking those things can move us. So this is someone who says, "Sister Teresa, your presentation has been a balm to my soul. When I tuned into your presentation, I had just read an article on the national publication of my denomination that ignored our founders, our abuelitas, and other important persons. I'm a retired professor, and my sisters and brothers are urging me and helping me to recover our collective memory. You have inspired me and given me some directions to consider that are very incarnational and gospel-centered. Dios la bendiga. Alberto L. Garcia, Reverend Doctor. No questions, just un abrazo."
Un abrazo también. Dios te bendiga.
All right. I think that is as good a note as any to say, thank you so much to Sister Teresa for this very wise and story-filled presentation. We are so grateful to you. Thank you for bringing to the fore the gifts of Latina Catholics, and especially for the gifts you yourself bring to the church. I want to thank Alice Cameron for running all the tech tonight, and Mary Pruniski for her support on this, her final Aquinas Center event. We're so thankful for her service to the Aquinas Center. Please join us. Our next lecture is going to be on October 26th, which is our annual Catholic Orthodox lecture. And in that one, I'll be continuing this kind of arts conversation. I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Katie Kalitis on what is Orthodox and Catholic fiction in the age of the nuns. I know NES, unlike the sisters we've been talking with tonight. So thank you again, Sister Teresa, for this wonderful presentation. I hope that you all have a wonderful evening, and may God bless you all.